Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Andrew Sollinger, publisher of Foreign Policy, and I'm very excited to lead this next conversation on how populism, nationalism, and partisanship has upended longstanding global relationships, both on the government and corporate levels. The global pandemic has only accelerated this shift, of course, and we're going to discover and uncover key questions and how we should answer them, including how have these trends impacted markets and companies? How can communicators bridge these chasms? And are we really facing unprecedented challenges, or can international relations history, recent and not so recent, help put the present trends in better context and help us navigate them? Joining me are two experts with in-depth government experience. They're much smarter than I and can help explain what's going on. We have Glen Fukushima. He's senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and he's former president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan and former deputy assistant U.S. trade representative for Japan and China. Welcome, Glen. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.
And we're also joined by Richard Harrington, chairman of UK and senior counselor of APCO. He's a former UK government minister in Parliament. Richard served as UK Parliamentary Undersecretary of State at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and also as Parliamentary Undersecretary of State at the Department for Work and Pensions. Gentlemen, welcome. Richard, thank you for joining us as well.
Great pleasure, Andrew.
Great.
Good morning, everybody. It's afternoon for me.
Good morning and afternoon to you. So I'd like to start with nationalism and specifically consumer nationalism. Big topic of conversation right now globally. Multinational companies are on a bit of a tightrope as they balance their own ethics and morals with shareholder responsibility. So globally, that is most relevant with Xinjiang and Uyghur production of cotton in China. Most recently, H&M, Nike, and other multinationals have been pilloried in China for taking a stand against forced labor in Xinjiang and now face huge boycotts. And this is a big risk and issue for these companies. And I have a slide, actually, that I'd like to share with everyone just to talk a little bit about the headline risk that we're facing. I hope you can see that. It's a little blurry for me. But these are articles from Foreign Policy talking about how there are big risks in doing business in China. And that's a global issue, and it predates this most recent issue. On the upper right, you'll see that recalling that the NBA had problems in China when one of their officials, a general manager of the Houston Rockets, called out the repression in Hong Kong. And this has had wide-ranging ramifications across industry, even in technology and semiconductors, and we've done a lot of work on that. So if we could, thank you very much for sharing that slide. I'd like to go back to Richard now on this, and not necessarily start with Boris Johnson's basketball game. That was a very interesting picture of him attempting a layup, but really to talk more about transatlantic relations and the alliance, which seems to be back on. The UK and the EU have joined the US in sanctioning Chinese officials in concert and are now receiving also a lot of blowback. Long negotiated China-EU trade agreements are now in question. And back to that story that I just shared, Huawei is now on the outs in the UK. So the question for you is this: is it just me, or because of the position I sit in and what I do all day long, or is government affairs increasingly impacting corporate behavior and rising on the list of priorities in the C-suite? And would love your perspective on that.
Well, I would argue, Andrew, this is nothing new. You know, trade and politics, trade and government have always gone together. Trade originally was a weapon of colonialism. You know, the British Empire was founded on the East India Company for commercial reasons, and so were most of, the other, at the time, the European empires. The United States power came through economic power and selective use of it as well. So I'm sorry to make it sound like it's insignificant. It's serious, but I really don't think there's anything new here at all. And China, whose regime generally doesn't doesn't shall we say, satisfy or please the vast majority of us in the West, because we're liberal democracies. There are many things to do with China that we have turned a blind eye to. If we suddenly start criticizing the Chinese, given that it's a controlled society and everyone follows government policy, it doesn't surprise me that their system of revenge is a kind of consumer nationalism. However unpleasant it is, and it's really unpleasant, it's not as unpleasant as the kind of consumer nationalism that alternative to it that happened before the Second World War or before the First World War. And I think we have to put it in perspective. But not happy about it, but I think we have to live with it. And American companies and European companies, countries who are doing what we do, and I believe in sanctions, I believe in using trading power for political purposes if we think it's the right thing. But we have to accept that, unfortunately, there's another side to that coin. It will affect our companies and consequently employment in our country, or indeed our populations from enjoying cheap and products that they want to buy.
Very interesting. And Glenn, it's also interesting to see some more recent precedent that puts a little bit of this type of activity with China and this adversarial trade relationship we see with China in perspective. And you have a lot of personal experience with that.
Right. Well, I agreed with Richard that this is nothing new, the relationship between government policy and trade and commerce. And I worked at off the U.S. Trade Representative from 1985 to 90. And during that time, we had some very intensive trade negotiations with Japan. And many of the issues that we're dealing with economically with China, not on the security side, but economically, whether it's semiconductors, supercomputers, industrial policy, government subsidies, these are all very similar issues to what we dealt with Japan 30 years ago. So I think it is important to keep these issues in perspective. And even between the US and the EU, we've had all these Airbus, Boeing problems. We've had, retaliation on French wine and so forth. So I think it's, because China is such a big and rising power, a lot of the attention now is focused on China. But I think you see a lot of examples in the past with Japan, with the EU and other countries where this relation between government policy and business and commerce are really intertwined. And I think increasingly we're going to see this. And the other factor, too, I think that's important is that it's often been the case that in the U.S. we try to see the two separate. That is the political side and military security side on the one hand versus the economic and commercial side. But I think especially in dealing with China, we're going to see a kind of a combination of the two, a melding of the national security concerns and the technology and economic concerns.
Makes a lot of sense. Interestingly, we're seeing very much a reflection of these types of issues domestically as well. I mean, the big talk, and this obviously has very little to do with global affairs as much as local affairs, but big goings on in Georgia in particular with Delta and Coca-Cola and Major League Baseball taking some actions as a result of voting rights. And there's a big, in all of your newspapers, I'm sure you've seen signed letters from all sorts of corporate officials protesting these issues. And that's very divisive and political here in the US. Maybe you could address that for us, Glenn, a little bit domestically also, and the ramifications of that, and how corporate communicators should be addressing these issues.
Sure, as you say, I mean, a lot of these and most of the global issues really have an impact on domestic, local issues, and certainly with regard to the law in Georgia that's been passed by the Georgia State Legislature has created considerable controversy, and certain companies like Delta and Coca-Cola and others have come out and opposed and objected to those changes. And then in turn, some politicians have kind of retaliated against some of those companies by holding back, tax preferences and so forth. But it's something that I think we're going to see even more of. And certainly on the political side and economic side, that's true. But also even on the kind of the cultural side, as an Asian American myself, I've noticed that the fact that the U.S.-China tensions, and especially over the last year, where we've had so many American political leaders criticizing the pandemic, the coronavirus, as originating from China, I think that has contributed to the anti-Asian hate crimes and violence in the United States, including in Atlanta recently. And so this link between the global and international affairs on the one hand and the domestic affairs is something that we see on all levels, whether it's economic, political, cultural, racial. And so I think this is also something that communicators really need to be very aware of, and also corporations need to have really clear moral, ethical guidelines that are I think need to be revised as times warrant. But I think it is important for companies to have these ethical and moral principles that they will adhere to.
You actually mentioned a very, and that's close to home when you talking about some of this anti-Asian sentiment that has been fomented in the U.S. You brought up the example of Vincent Chin, which you might remind our participants about from long ago.
Sure. Well, in 1982, in June of 1982, there was a famous incident in Detroit, Michigan, where Vincent Chin, who was a young Chinese American, U.S. citizen of Chinese ancestry, was actually at a bachelor's party getting ready for a wedding a few days later. But he had an altercation, a fight with two white unemployed auto workers, Chrysler auto workers. And these two white unemployed auto workers mistook Vincent Chin to be a Japanese national and basically accused him of having created the conditions where these two were laid off from their auto companies because of Japanese competition. And so these two white unemployed auto workers bludgeoned to death this Chinese American. And not only did they bludgeon him to death, but also when the two white unemployed auto workers were put on trial, the judge basically said, "Well, these are not people we should put in jail." So he imposed $3,000 fines on each of them, and they served no jail time. So this created a huge uproar in the Asian American community, and it still remains as one of the landmark cases of anti-Asian violence. But anti-Asian violence actually is, I think, a lot of the commentary that we're seeing now reaches back to the 1800s when the Chinese first started immigrating to the United States. So that's a long history, but this relationship between the domestic and the international certainly played itself out in the early 80s with the U.S.-Japan auto conflicts, and now with the U.S.-China conflicts as well.
And a very sad story to have to recount, considering recent activities and recent events that we've seen. So thank you for sharing that, though, and reminding us of that. I want to remind our participants, those that are watching, please do ask questions. Even though our panelists are agreeing on lots of issues, we want to create some tension so you can challenge them if you so choose. I'd like to now turn a little bit towards the pandemic and how that's impacting these very same activities. Again, it's exacerbating some of the issues we're seeing. But Richard, I can't go any further without recounting how the UK is now opening up. It's a success story. Vaccine rollouts in the UK versus Europe are fantastic. A little over a year ago, companies were assuming they needed to move out of London because of Brexit and relocate into Europe. And now it's hurrah for Brexit, and it worked wonderfully. And you're all in the pubs and having lunch with business partners again. So it's great, right? Boris did a fantastic job.
Andrew, I know you've got this idea that we're all dancing in the streets with our pints of lukewarm beer because the vaccine program's been successful. And yeah, the vaccine program has been successful. I've had my second jab. Most of my family have. We can drink or eat outside, which, given that it was just above freezing point last night, actually is better in theory than in practice. The serious point, the second bit of what you brought up, is it's a sort of booster of nationalism. Oh, we're so great at the vaccine and the European Union are not. But we have real troubles here with exports. Exports have fallen dramatically. The politicians' mantra of free trade, free trade, free trade sounds really good. But in fact, it's not tariffs that hold up trade, it's bureaucracy and paperwork. And that really has hit a lot of companies in this country. So underneath the surface, we've scored brownie points, and well done to the government for buying the vaccines and distributing them very efficiently, and richer people have had no access to it more quickly than poorer people. We have a problem with some ethnic minorities not taking it up, despite leaders really encouraging them to do so. But I think we're overcoming that slowly. And all the conspiracy theorists are out, and it's all Bill Gates, and it's all tracking it. But generally, it's been extremely successful. But the effects of Brexit, I am concerned about. I think it will take a long time to get it through the system. The great hope for government, or certain elements of them, is a trade deal with the United States. We come back in a way to nationalism. I am not optimistic about a trade deal for the United States. First of all, because Mr. Biden, President Biden, who's got so much to do, has made it clear it's not going to be a priority, and I don't blame him in the slightest for that. But secondly, the American system, the democratic system, and the vested interests who hold sway in many areas, and that's in any democracy. You know, you've got oil companies on the one side, big pharma, etc., responsible for billions and billions of dollars and employment all over the country and everything. You know, they're not going to give in as easy as possible. So there is nationalism, and it comes back to the pandemic nationalism. I actually think is newspaper headlines and everything like that. The other countries will catch up quite quickly. But underneath, I had hoped that when President Trump was not re-elected, and without going into all the stuff about Trump, which I have no place to do because he wasn't my president, well, nor Mr. Biden. I mean, I'm just not American. I wasn't making a comment. But I was hoping as an internationalist that it would put an end to some of the nationalism. For example, when I was Minister for Steel and other industries here, we had very political, well, they weren't really sanctions, but tariffs and things against us, including Scotch whisky, despite the fact we couldn't have two more friendlier countries in the world. So nationalism always rears its ugly head. It comes back, I'm afraid, to history as well. And as far as the pandemic's concerned, I think what we're actually seeing is it's a competition between controlled societies and our liberal democratic societies. The Chinese side of it very much to suppress knowledge, data, say that they've dealt with it, extreme lockdowns when necessary, tracing people beyond a certain level that we could ever do in the West. It's been all over the place, very patchy, some countries better than other countries. It's different states in the United States showing different policies and everything, or countries in Europe the same. But I do think our system will lead to, because of the massive data sharing and AI and all of the things that will be used to cut down pandemics in the future, I do see it as a victory for liberal democracy against the more controlled type of government.
It does seem to be trending in that direction, and that's very hopeful to hear. And speaking of nationalism and competition, I can think of no global event that kind of encapsulates that, a friendly nationalism, let's say, and competition than the Olympics, which of course have also been impacted terribly by the pandemic. Last summer's Tokyo Olympics were postponed to this coming summer. The Tokyo Olympics are on this summer, starting in July, still. And it's only open to Japanese, of course, but so no global travel. But there is a huge backlash. The Kyodo News Service last week did a survey and said 70% of Japanese think the Olympics should be scrapped or postponed again. And the anti-Olympic activist Misako Ichimura is pronouncing it, to be gold medals over people's lives. Glenn, turning back to you, is hosting the Olympics for the Japanese in Tokyo and globally at a time when friendly global competition can be a positive thing, and generally is hosting the Olympics this year a good idea?
Well, personally, I think that there are some major challenges to holding the Olympics, especially because right now the trend in Japan is that the fourth wave is coming in Japan. I mean, if it were going the other way, I would be more optimistic. But actually, this coming Friday, Prime Minister Suga from Japan is coming to Washington and is meeting with President Biden. Prime Minister Suga is the first foreign leader to meet in person with President Biden since the election in the United States. And they'll be discussing a lot of issues, including China and the pandemic and so forth. And I assume that the Prime Minister will ask the President to be supportive of Japan hosting the Olympics. And I think for the Japanese government, certainly, ever since Prime Minister Abe was successful several years ago in leading the Japanese effort to get the Olympics to Tokyo. Because in 1964, when Japan first hosted the Olympics, it really was a huge event. It was kind of Japan showing to the world how it had recovered from World War II. And so, and it had, all new freeways, the new bullet train system, all sorts of things, infrastructure were created in order to accomplish that. It was an extremely successful event for Japan in 1964. I think, although it's not that scale, the Japanese government was certainly hoping that in 2020, Japan could show to the rest of the world how well it was doing, especially in terms of technology and management of the events and so forth. But with the pandemic, it's really been a somewhat politicized issue. And as you rightly point out, according to public opinion polls, somewhere between 70 to 80% of the Japanese public believe that it should either be canceled or postponed. I assume that because it has been such an important issue from the Japanese government's point of view, and I think actually Prime Minister Suga won't go into too much detail, but he has the election coming up in September for the presidency of the Liberal Democratic Party, and then for the in the lower house of Japan. So I think with the political environment being what it is, I think the Japanese government will very likely go ahead with the Olympics. Although, as I say, depending on how things develop over the next month or two, there's some possibility that it would be either canceled or postponed again. But I think that they're going to try very hard, and especially now that they've limited the spectators pretty much to Japanese nationals, and then some few invited guests, dignitaries, leaders, and so forth. And the Japanese being very good at managing events, I think they'll do a good job if they decide to go ahead and do it. But there are some challenges still remaining for Japan.
So that's a very helpful analysis. Thank you. And now I know this gets a little bit out of our depth, I think, on this panel, but so maybe our participants want to weigh in. But there are a lot of big brands participating today, and many of them see and use the Olympics as a huge marketing opportunity. Care to wade into either Glen or Richard on how they might play that this year? Is it a marketing opportunity or a catastrophe to be associated with Olympics such as this on such a tough year? What's your take?
You'll now know why I'm not a good politician, Andrew, because most politicians would have a glib answer to that, and I actually don't know. I mean, certainly in the previous troubled Olympics of our life, my generation, when the with Soviet Union and bans and boycotts and everything, it certainly suppressed the commercial angle very much so. I think as far as this one is concerned, I just think the Olympics have become such a huge institution. I don't believe that there'll be the same kind of pressure on commercial boycotts or anything like that. And I think the advertising and promotion may be a bit softer. It may have messaging to do with, could be climate change, could be the number of people that have died from the pandemic and everything else. So it won't quite be the waving of flags and jumping in quite the same way that, for example, London 2012 was, or Rio last time. But I don't think it's a no-no.
I think, that a lot depends on what happens between now and July. I mean, if things get better, I think it can actually be kind of used in a way that some people hope, that it's kind of a vindication or a kind of a manifestation or demonstration by countries that despite the pandemic, were able to do the Olympics. And it's kind of overcoming adversity. And so, I mean, I think it could be, portrayed in that way if things improve significantly between now and July. But so I agree with Richard that I don't think that brands are going to be kind of jeopardized in terms of criticism for companies participating and in this Olympics. It's really the Beijing Olympics, where I think there are some real questions about whether companies should participate and in what form, and criticism I'm sure will be arising from certain quarters about human rights violations and so forth.
Of course. And the U.S. has already announced that it will likely boycott, or has officially announced it will boycott the Beijing 22 Olympics.
No, I don't think so. I think what happened was that the White House spokesperson was asked about the fact the Europeans are discussing it, and the White House spokesperson said that the U.S. has not made any decision with regard to the Beijing Olympics. So there was some uncertainty and ambiguity, and therefore had to be clarified later. But it is true that it's my understanding that some European countries have started to talk about it, and there was some suspicion that perhaps the U.S. is also thinking about it. But my impression at this point in the commentary that I've heard so far in the U.S. is that it's rather unlikely that the U.S. will boycott. But again, it depends on what happens over the next several months.
Great, thank you for clarifying, Glenn. We only have a few minutes left, and I do want to move on to one very large topic that I think, while frightening, is a little more hopeful. And that's the one global issue that could be bigger than the pandemic, as the pandemic, hopefully starts to fade, and that is climate. This is a common issue around the globe. Secretary Kerry, the U.S. climate czar, will be in Shanghai shortly for the first in China meeting with a cabinet official from the Biden administration to discuss climate issues with his counterpart. They're hosting a climate summit next week on Earth Day. FP is also hosting a climate summit following on that. I'm going to more on that in a moment. I'd like to invite everyone to join us. This is a very big issue that the globe is unifying around. And many companies are embracing zero emissions goals as part of their stakeholder platforms. I'd like to know whether you think this is a good idea, if it's a rush to the greenwashing bandwagon. Obviously, and I'm talking about this from a corporate perspective. This is clearly an issue that needs to be addressed, but it seems everyone from fossil fuel providers to technology companies and clothing manufacturers are jumping on this bandwagon. I'd just be very interested to know your take on this. And Richard, I would look to you to give us a little of your take, and maybe even some historical perspective on what's happening on the climate front.
Well, I think it's by far the biggest issue facing us. I think it will lead to bigger changes than even the Industrial Revolution did in the 19th century, when the UK dominated the world through economic power with coal, etc., and then the United States did later on with fossil fuels. But I would like to put this into perspective. This is, again, I know I'm a bit like a broken record, but it's nothing new. For my European history, in 1815 there was a huge volcano which erupted in Indonesia. Krakatoa is the famous one, but that was later on in the 19th century. I'm afraid I can't remember the name, but it was so huge that the noise could be heard 1,000 miles away, and a lot of leaders thought that they were being attacked because of the noise that came from it. And that volcano led to a big weather change. It allowed the Prussian army, because of torrential rains, to join. It allowed the time, because Napoleon couldn't act, for his soldiers to arrive, which basically saved Wellington. It affected European geopolitics for 200 years because of that, because of France, Germany, and ourselves, etc. It caused starvation in China, which led to this century of humiliation in China, which we are now seeing the fight back from, that national humiliation. And it led to starvation and credit crunches throughout Europe. So I'm saying this because climate change, there's evidence of the dramatic changes it had in very different times. And how do we bridge divides? How do we stop it leading to the kind of nationalism that happened in the 19th century, to disaster, not in the United States, but in much of the rest of the world? And I do feel somehow that again, we have to fight nationalism. But nationalism, Andrew, it all comes down to democracy, votes. Votes are what put politicians in. So they've got to look sometimes to the short-term interest of their voters, which sometimes is not part of the global interest in climate change, etc. But I do see a seed change. I'm so pleased the United States is back in Paris, the agreement, and I think there is hope for us to learn from this, because even countries with a totally different agenda to ourselves realize that climate change is the most fundamental thing, and it's real. I'm not one of these green, it used to be just a sort of fatty type green thing. It's really fundamental, and I think the effects could be absolutely catastrophic. That's why the financial community is so worried about it, because of the effects it can have. The security forces all over the world are worried about it because of rioting, starvation, etc. The humanitarian, because of flooding of islands and all these countries that will disappear. So no place for nationalism, but I'm afraid it's a big battle. But I do think the world has learned some of its lessons.
Great. And thank you so much. I know we're pretty much out of time, but Glenn, I wanted to just give you an opportunity to comment on that as well, if you had any thoughts on that, climate, et cetera.
I agree with Richard that climate is a huge issue, a very significant issue, not only on the governmental level but also on the corporate level. And I think it is really incumbent upon companies to contribute to the effort to stop climate change. I would also add that climate is one of the issues, one of the probably few issues which is really truly global. And even countries that are at odds with each other, like the United States and China, on so many issues, should be able to cooperate on for mutual interest. And I think also probably, nuclear non-proliferation and pandemics are also, global issues that we really need to work together on and stem the nationalism and promote global cooperation.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And I also, first of all, I want to thank you both for a really stimulating and an interesting discussion. I learned a lot from it. I hope our participants did also. I want to apologize to our participants because I'm now seeing the questions come through from Vera and Michael. And for some reason, I didn't get them in my chat until just now. My window was closed there. So I'm sorry we didn't get to them. And we don't have time today, but hopefully we'll be able to discuss these issues later on EU's trade-based policy and how technology is changing nationalism, mercantilism. We'll do it for another panel and another day.
Foreign policy can host something.
Yes, perhaps we can. Speaking of foreign policy hosting something, I just wanted to move to our last slide as we close to talk a little bit about the foreign policy virtual climate summit. You're all invited. Please reach out to me at andrew.sollinger@foreignpolicy.com if you'd like to attend. As you can see on the right, we've got an entire great list of world leaders, including John Kerry, President Duque of Colombia, ministers, the Prime Minister of Iceland, etc. It'll be a great wrap up and recap of everything that will be discussed next week at Biden's summit. So please do reach out to me if you'd like to attend. But again, Glenn, Richard, thank you so much for joining me and for your comments. I really appreciated the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew.